This video is going to be all about control arms. I want to talk about why they're so necessary, some things to look for, and some things to avoid. All right, let's get to it. Now, the vehicles that I'll be focusing on the most in this video are the Jeep Wrangler JL platform and the Jeep Gladiator platform. That being said, a lot of this is still going to be applicable to anything really with a link suspension. Now, from the factory, the JL and Gladiator have what I consider a 5-link style suspension, and what that is 4 fixed length control arms with a track bar. That's how it works both front and rear. Now, the Gladiator suspension design is a good bit different than the Wrangler suspension design in the rear, as the Gladiator arms are stacked more on top of each other, creating a little bit more of a binding feature that's better for towing, not as good for articulating off-road. If you want to know more sort of pros and cons, Gladiator versus Wrangler, I'll put a link to a video right here where you can learn more about that. So when do you really need an aftermarket control arm? Well, a lot of that comes down to how much you're lifting your vehicle. The 392 you see behind me has a 2.5-inch suspension kit from a company called JKS Manufacturing. And with this particular kit, it came with an aftermarket lower control arm. That's just a lower, no upper. I'll get more into that a little bit later, but the idea here is it needed to do 2 jobs. That lower control arm is not only going to help recenter the axle, so whenever the tire cycles, it cycles more in the center of the wheel well, but it's also going to affect the caster of the vehicle. Now, your caster is your position of your axle. Let's say this is the center line of the axle and this is where the ball joint is. If your axle starts to tilt downwards, it's going to be facing, that means your steering links are facing into the ground. Your steering is going to get very heavy. You're going to be fighting it. You want positive caster, where your steering is actually going to feel light. It's going to give it that easier return to center feel, and it's going to be where the steering feels a bit lighter. Okay, so let's talk fixed length control arms versus adjustable control arms. I think it's important to note here that a lot of entry-level suspension kits come with fixed length arms, and it's a good and bad thing. I will say the good about a fixed length control arm is there's no jam nut to come loose. There's nothing to really service or worry about. You don't have to worry about screwing up, having an arm that's too long or too short. If you're a DIY guy that's installing this yourself, you basically get the arm in the spot, bolt it in. It's pretty easy. It's kind of foolproof. Now, that being said, there are some serious downsides if you're going to go with a fixed length control arm, and it really has to do with fine tuning the Jeep. Let's say I took this thing to get aligned and it was off, the wheelbase was off, one of the brackets maybe just had been bent, or anything, any number of things. I have no way of fine tuning that with a fixed length control arm. You're stuck with what you got, and so you might end up having to spring to get an adjustable control arm like what I have in my hand here to dial that in. Adjustable arms are simply just going to be more expensive. The thing about an adjustable arm as well is they typically have either some sort of pinch bolt or jam nut to allow you to adjust that arm, and these jam nuts, if you wheel your vehicle frequently, will and can come loose. So you need to paint mark them, really stay on top of them so you can see if anything is coming loose. So that's going to be a good indicator, hey, you got a problem, or maybe you've pushed past what that suspension joint can handle. So let's talk control arm joints. Now, from the factory, you have a rubber bushing at every single control arm, and rubber is fantastic not only for durability, reliability, but it's great at absorbing vibration. So it's one of the reasons that you get that smooth ride and you don't feel so much feedback from the road in your steering wheel. If you go to the aftermarket, you're going to see that so many companies have a wide variety of bushing types. Usually your more entry-level bushing is going to be a simple replacement of that OE Cleveite style rubber bushing. That's what you're going to have on a ton of your entry-level suspension kits. And I'll tell you right now, if you're looking for the best riding bushing for a daily driver, you really can't beat a rubber bushing. It gives you long-lasting life. You don't have any squeaks or anything weird with it. It's great at vibration absorption. You don't have to maintain it. Rubber's great. It's not a really big thing. The downside of a rubber joint, I'll show you, has to do with flexibility. So I'm going to take this screwdriver here, Your typical rubber bushing, you're not really going to be able to flex too much. Not by hand, not by any, just a little bit. Maybe I'm just weak, but you get the point. Rubber is going to go back to shape, but it's not going to give you a lot of misalignment. It's not going to let it flex a ton in the arm. So you're going to sacrifice some of that articulation, which is going to make the ride not as smooth off-road. The axle's not going to be able to cycle and soak up things as easily as it twists down the trail. That's why most aftermarket suspension manufacturers go with a flex style joint. Now, a flex style joint is often referred to as a Johnny joint, but I will tell you, a Johnny joint is actually a Johnny joint made by Curry, aka Rock Jock, however you want to do the company now. Either way, it's invented by John Curry, and it is essentially the gold standard of joints. And the way a flex joint is basically been replicated through time is you have a steel ball that gets pivoted between two bushings that are typically some type of polyurethane, and they're captured inside of the joint. The idea here is the ball can rotate freely as you go off-road. As you can see here, joint is still straight. You can see the angle of the screwdriver. You got a much larger angle, and as you're going down the trail, it can flex more freely without a lot of bind. The idea here is as your axle is going down the road, it's going to be able to twist back and forth and cycle without, giving you a big issue. The big challenge with these, not only is this going to be a more expensive joint, but this is going to be something that you have to grease and maintain and rebuild. That being said, rubber and flex joints aren't all that there is, and there's actually really a new player in this category, and I don't know the perfect name for it. Rockcrawler calls it an adventure joint, and basically what it is, it's like a vulcanized rubber bushing that gives you sort of the similar misalignment and that degree deflection of a flex joint, but it does not have the polyurethane. It's actually pivoting with rubber. So you're getting that very similar joint absorption as you would a traditional rubber bushing, but you're getting the benefit of the high misalignment that a flex joint can give you. I think the Rockcrawler arms that I have under my Gladiator on 40s have around 35 degrees of deflection, and that is around the same as a Johnny joint. So not only am I getting all of that flexibility, but I'm getting the rubber bushing, so it's maintenance free. I don't have to worry about greasing it in any periodical things. I live in the southeast, so I'm definitely dealing with mud and sand a lot. I don't have to worry about that getting in there and eating it up, but it's still rebuildable. So if it does become an issue, gets torn, gets worn, I can replace it. Now, other companies like Metal Cloak and Synergy have their own versions of this, and you can go through and see all the different comparison tests to who's got the best. I'm not going to sit here and say who I think has the best joint, because I've never tested every single suspension joint out there, and I think unless you have a way to test them all in a very equal and organized way and scientific, you'd be really putting yourself out there as making a mistake saying, oh, this is definitely the best. I do want to mention one more style of joint, which is become, a lot of people say they call them Heim joints. Heim is actually a company. They're spherical rod ends, and they're usually used on either race applications where vibration absorption isn't an issue because it's really just riding on a very thin layer of Teflon on the inside. These things are metal. They're meant to be extremely strong. They're meant to give you a ton of flexibility and movability. Usually in the Jeep world, you'll only see them on sway bar end links. That's not a typical joint that's used as a control arm, not for a daily driver, and I wouldn't recommend it for a daily driver. If you're on the extreme end and your Jeep is just a toy, it's a great way to go, but you are going to get more of that feedback through your steering wheel, and a lot more of that vibration is going to come through the cab by having such a heavy-duty spherical rod ends. Okay, so let's talk about control arm design, or really what I want to talk about is control arm bends. An arm like this is bent with a very specific purpose, and as you see it, this is a JKS control arm, and what the bend you see here is designed to do is actually give you tire clearance. The goal of having a bin like this really accomplishes a few things. Number one, when you're going to move up to a taller tire, you need to have room for that tire to cycle as you're steering back and forth. Having an arm with a bend in it such as this one is going to give you that room that you need for that larger tire to be able to not hit on the arm. Now that's a big thing here, and the reason I wanted to focus on that, from the factory your arm has a sort of similar kink or bend in it. All the JL and Gladiators do, and it's one of the reasons that you can run a 35 direct from the factory on these Jeeps now. If you are going to go with a much larger than stock tire, let's say you're going to move up to a 38, just having the bend in the arm isn't going to allow you to maintain a stock wheel and run that tall of a tire. You're going to need to still space that tire away from the Jeep. So if you want to keep your factory wheel, depending on what wheel it is and what tire you opt for, you still may end up rubbing on the arm. The advantage of actually looking for an arm that has this bend though will allow you to run a higher numerical back spacing over a arm that's either straight or bent up for clearance. And the reason why that's important is it's going to give you the best scrub radius by keeping that tire tucked in under the vehicle and allowing it to pivot more correctly as it should with the ball joints. That being said, there are other arms that you're going to see that are either straight, which straight arms are fine. They're going to be very strong, but they're not going to give you the ground clearance of something that has an arched bend. A great example of this you can find with like a rock crawler arm, where they actually bend the arm not necessarily for tire clearance, but they're doing it for ground clearance, and that arched bend that they put into it will help you on the trail. And that's really important on something like a Gladiator that has such a longer wheelbase where the arm is really hanging down a lot. I've been on the Rubicon Trail all over Moab in the southeast. I can tell you the rear arms hit more than anything else on the Gladiator in my experience. On the Wrangler, it's not as big of a deal, but you definitely still impact the arm. The downside of going with an arm like a rock crawler arm that's bent for that clearance is it's not really bent in like this JKS arm is for tire clearance. It's just ground clearance you're getting. So you might have to go with a wheel that has less numerical back spacing, which means your scrub radius isn't going to be as good and your steering might be a little heavier. My Jeep, I ended up going with a 4 3/4 inch wheel, and the reason is I needed to clear the shock reservoir up front with these 37-inch tall trail grapplers because it's a very true to size 37. I wanted this tire for its performance attributes, and obviously I love the way it looks. It looks super cool. So this tire made the most sense for this package, and I just needed to have a wheel that accommodated that. Now lastly, I do want to touch briefly on control arm strength. For the most part, you're going to find DOM 2-inch quarter wall lowers. Uppers can vary, and there are companies that make some really nice high-end billet aluminum arms. Whatever your budget can handle, I would just go with that. You're really not going to get a cheap like Chinese control arm that's going to break on you. I feel like those days are behind us, or at least I hope they are. There are so many reputable companies that make good quality parts. I've had great luck with control arms from Rock Crawler, Evo, JKS Manufacturing, BDS, Synergy. There's more good quality control arms and companies out there building fantastic parts than there are crappy ones, so I wouldn't sweat that too much. But that's really all I got to say about control arms. I promise I'm over. It's done now. And if you've made it to the end, I really appreciate it. If you do have any questions, drop them in the comments. If you do thinking I'm doing a halfway decent job, please consider subscribing to the channel and maybe even liking the video. It absolutely helps. The goal with all of these is to educate, entertain, and inform. That's why the Driving Line channel exists. If you want to see what I'm working on behind the scenes, you can check me out on all social platforms at Ali Mansour Editor. And until next time, I appreciate you guys watching, and I hope to see you on the trail. Take care.